That's for Dan Cedarbaum. Left us too soon. Was always able to see both sides of things, and I really miss him.
Thank you, Joey. Welcome to a life of Torah, Avodah, and Chesed, an evening of learning in memory of Dan Cedarbaum. I'm Eric Kaplan. I'm a co-founder and vice president of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. As many of you know, Dan was the executive director of the Kaplan Center and a co-founder. But as my colleague Jeffrey Shine and I wrote in our eulogy for him, in truth, Dan was the center of the center, the force that made the work possible. Above all, he was our friend, and his death is a great personal loss. And I know that you share this great sense of loss. Tonight we gather to give thanks for the many blessings that Dan brought into our lives by remembering some of our experiences with him while engaging in one of his favorite pursuits, Jewish learning. Three scholars, Catherine Madsen, Rabbi Shai Held, and Rabbi Dr. Rachel Sabath Beit-Halachmi, will each lead us through a brief text study chosen to reflect some aspect of Dan's personality, interests, and life's work. Each of them knew Dan well, and Dan admired them and truly enjoyed their company. I'll say just really a sentence about each one. Catherine is an author of books of liturgy that, as you know, Dan was a tremendous lover of Jewish liturgy. She's also a novelist and the author of multiple essays. Shai is the president and dean of Hadar. He's the author also of a wonderful book on Heschel and two excellent volumes of Torah commentary that Dan said I must buy and has not regretted. And finally, Rachel is a congregational rabbi, author, and a senior scholar of the Kaplan Center, and has, like all three, been a part of our programs. We're going to begin with Catherine, and we're going to continue to Shai and then to Rachel, and I will not intervene in the middle. And at the end, we're going to hear from Jacob Cedarbaum, one of Dan's sons, who will say a few words on behalf of the family. The chat area of Zoom is open throughout the program so that you can share your own memories of Dan. We will gather your comments and give them to the Cedarbaum Jacobs family. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the Kaplan Center, Hadar, and Judaism Unbound. Like so much of Dan's work, this program is the result of a true partnership. I want to specifically thank Morty Labaton of Hadar, Dan Liebenson of Judaism Unbound, the three presenters that you're about to hear from, and of course, Joey Weisenberg, the director of Hadar's Rising Song Institute, for leading us into this program in such a beautiful and meaningful way. I can tell you, Joey, that Dan would not settle on the date for a Kaplan Center conference before making sure that you were available to lead services there. This program is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. If you are uncomfortable with this, you may wish to turn off your camera. Catherine?
There are 10 strong things in the world. Rock is strong, but iron breaks it. Iron is strong, but fire melts it. Fire is strong, but water quenches it. Water is strong, but the clouds bear it. The clouds are strong, but the wind drives them. The wind is strong, but the body withstands it. The body is strong, but fear breaks it. Fear is strong, but wine dissolves it. Wine is strong, but sleep dispels it. And death is stronger than all. What is stronger than death? Acts of tzedakah, as it is written, tzedakah delivers from death. That's a text from Bava Batra 10a in the Babylonian Talmud. Rather remarkably for the Talmud, it's an incantation. Although it's situated in a larger halachic discussion, it doesn't present you with a straightforward account of your obligations. What it really seems to want to do is to enchant you into your obligations, to bind you aesthetically to doing the right thing ethically. It presents tzedakah as the all but inevitable next step in a series of natural relationships between the animate and the inanimate, between natural forces and human reactions. A mitzvah is never inevitable. It's always and necessarily a choice. But this text suggests that the urge toward tzedakah is the natural reaction to death. Reaction in the sense of resistance, as if tzedakah were the natural opponent of death, its antagonist, its master, as fire melts iron, or water quenches fire, or the clouds are driven on the wind. The linkage of beauty and morality in this text is unexpected and is spoken with enormous authority. Only the best poets and songwriters and storytellers and the best liturgists know how to do this, to present a moral imperative in a way that never feels like a moral lesson. Our nerves, our chromosomes line up like iron filings towards such an imperative, the way they do when we discover our true work or our true love. Yes, we say with the whole of our intuition and the whole of our intention, tzedakah delivers from death. But is it true? In a world where everybody dies, some in the fullness of years and some before, how can anyone say that tzedakah delivers from death? When a righteous man dies, a man of boundless energy, principled intelligence, endless generosity, and productive imagination, to suggest that more tzedakah would have saved him makes no sense and is a kind of desecration. Even the Unatana Tokef, which faces so starkly the contingency of our lives, doesn't dare make that claim. All it will say is that teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah ma'avirin et roa hagezerah, in some way mitigate the harshness of the decree. They don't cancel the decree. The exact meaning of ma'avirin is elusive. In the assortment of machzorim I have in hand, I find every translation from annul to avert, to transform, to remove, to make easier. But the grammar of the Hebrew sentence is cautious. It's not the decree itself, but the evil of the decree that is reduced. The Bava Batra text tells us it is written that tzedakah delivers from death. It is written, as it turns out, in Proverbs, in two different places, but most clearly in chapter 11, verse 4, Lo yo'il hun b'yom evra, utzdaka tatzil mimavet. Wealth will not avail in the day of wrath, but tzedakah delivers from death. The book of Proverbs as a whole favors the getting of wisdom over the accumulation of wealth, but here it seems to suggest a sort of metaphysical tax break for the rich, as if by shedding some of their wealth they can buy themselves safety. It's a little unattractive when you look at it up close. Of course, in one sense, it doesn't matter why you give tzedakah as long as you give it, but it's a little unseemly to give it with your own benefit in mind. It's occurred to me, particularly since the advent of COVID, but before that as well, that our thinking about these texts may be a little off. To take the most familiar text first, we think of the Unatana Tokef as an extended metaphor of our moral standing with God. The catalog of the many forms of death is undeniably literal, but the book of life and the sheep passing before the shepherd are clearly figurative. And by the time we get to the declaration that teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah temper the severity of the decree, we're inclined to hear it as part of the metaphor. Like the verse from Proverbs, we hear it as a way to rack up last-minute merit points in the book of life, a spiritual hack to get ourselves back in God's graces. If we don't believe God is real or really operates that way, we're inclined to dismiss the whole passage as abject wishful thinking or whistling in the dark. But what if these texts are not primarily about our standing with God? What if they're about our readiness to act in the world, the accuracy of our perceptions, the faithfulness of our attention, the efficacy of our actions? Teshuvah, as we know, is return, moral reorientation. Tefillah is the sum of our protest and our gratitude and the inventory list of our needs, but it's also a form of self-discipline, the simple ability to keep showing up. How do we think of tzedakah in this framework? Let's look again at the Bava Batra text a little more analytically this time. There's that long list of natural and human forces, something like a planetary game of rock, paper, scissors. And then in the last lines, we move from observable cause and effect to a moral claim. And I'll read it again. There are 10 strong things in the world. Rock is strong, but iron breaks it. Iron is strong, but fire melts it. Fire is strong, but water quenches it. Water is strong, but the clouds bear it. The clouds are strong, but the wind drives them. The wind is strong, but the body withstands it. The body is strong, but fear breaks it. Fear is strong, but wine dissolves it. Wine is strong, but sleep dispels it, and death is stronger than all. What is stronger than death? Acts of tzedakah, as it is written, tzedakah delivers from death. The first thing to notice is that the text doesn't say stronger than whose death. It's death in general, the fact of death, everybody's death. More critically and more interestingly, it doesn't specify who it is that tzedakah delivers from death. Clearly, it isn't everybody. The original text in Proverbs isn't clear on that point either. To say wealth will not avail in the day of wrath, but tzedakah delivers from death, is not quite to say wealth will not avail you, but if you give the money away, you will survive. Nor does the Unetana Tokef say from whom the evil of the decree is averted. All three texts leave open the possibility, and this is what incantations are for, to recalibrate the consciousness and bring about practical results, that the point of tzedakah is not to deliver the giver from death, it's to deliver the recipient from death. And as soon as you look at the text in that way, it's not metaphor anymore. It's literal and functional. You give money and goods and time and attention, and somebody else survives. This is at the center of Jewish thought and practice. Bava Batra may have made it aesthetically compelling, but it's even more ethically compelling. Think of the text in Mishnah Brachot that interprets Bechol Meodecha in the Shema as meaning you shall love the Lord your God with all your substance, with all your material possessions. Tzedakah is how you do that, by loving your neighbor with your substance and with your possessions. Some world traditions insist that love is not an emotion but a policy. To love someone is to commit yourself to their survival, their well-being, their future. Essentially, this reading is what Mordechai Kaplan called predicate theology, a theology based not on defining the nature of God, but on discovering the nature of godliness. Kaplan's unlovely word Elohut, which he substituted for the personal name Elohim, is rather an obstacle. It makes godliness sound abstract, which is the last thing it is. Godliness, though the word godliness too is tautological and misleading, is food on the tables and in the stomachs of the hungry, muscle on the bones of the weak, substance in the minds of the ignorant, physical and mental energy, health, sanity, self-determination. You don't need an abstract noun for this. You don't really even need a theology. You need food and kitchens and distribution networks and learning networks and libraries and medical research and medical care and people who make it happen, and stories and songs and perhaps even incantations that make the value of their work permanently clear. What matters is not how we explain or justify this work to ourselves at the theological level. What matters is the promise to others. You shall eat and be satisfied, and you shall bless. The death of a righteous man, a man who knew how to make things happen, who knew how to make strong intellectual and personal connections between people across the Jewish world who otherwise would not have met, who knew how to organize large numbers of people into groundbreaking conferences, who knew how to do things I don't even know about because he did them privately and to the direct benefit of their recipients. The death of such a man is a disruption in all the networks he belonged to. The sudden absence of this honored and admirable person, this forceful personality, this energy, brings the obligation of tzedakah keenly before us. Tzedakah is the antagonist of death. It's upon us to work for other people's survival and well-being, both because the Torah commands us and because Dan Cedarbaum's example compels us. It's upon us to continue with an energy equal to his, the work that he left unfinished, and the work that only we know how to do. May his memory be for a blessing.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to start with a few words about Dan that will lead us into the brief learning I want to do. Dan was, as all of us know, and in some ways above all else, a learner. Of all of the thousands and thousands of adults that I've been privileged to teach in my career, few, if any, loved learning quite as much as Dan. The way that I would encapsulate that is we have a very strict rule at Hadar that our rabbinic programs are only for rabbis. But the rule eventually got revised by Dan's sheer stubbornness and force of will. Rabbinic programs at Hadar were for rabbis and Dan Cedarbaum. He just participated as another rabbi in the room because he felt it was unfair for him to miss out on the kind of learning that we did with rabbis. Dan wasn't only a learner, he was also, as all of us also know, a doer. Most of us have ideas and treat them like moods. We more or less wait for them to go away so we can go on with our lives. Dan had ideas and he made them happen. He combined in ways that were truly incredible, learning and doing. One of the ways that was encapsulated for me in my own life is that every couple of months I would get a text from Dan that would say, "Do you have 5 or 10 minutes in the next day? Want to ask you something." And I never had any idea whether it was going to be, how do you punctuate this passage of the Mishnah, or who's coming to this conference? Who should I have speak about, X, Y, or Z? It could literally be anything from the smallest details of a Torah text to the most intricate details of getting a program right. The learning and the doing for Dan were totally seamless. Limud and Maaseh were one. Dan was also, and this is something I really admire because I think it's become rarer and rarer, a lover of Klal Yisrael. At a time when Jewish solidarity feels so attenuated, when a sense of us as family feels like it's been lost or almost lost, Dan embodied it. And it was another aspect, I think, of why he loved Mordechai Kaplan quite so much. There's a term that often came to my mind when I would talk to Dan, and I mean this in the most loving way possible, and Dan, I think, would have appreciated it. Dan was what Jews call a mishugal davar. He was totally crazy about the things that he loved. When he had an idea or he made a commitment, he stuck to it. And he was, as all of us probably experienced, like a force of nature. One of the craziest nights of my life took place in a car alone with Dan. Dan had scheduled an event in Chicago for me to discuss my book that had just been released about Abraham Joshua Heschel. And the day I arrived in Chicago was a polar vortex, as some of you may remember, in 2014. And I called Dan when I got in and I said, "Dan, don't be a lunatic. Cancel this event." And Dan said, "Why would I do that?" And I said, "Dan, nobody is going outdoors." And he said, "There are 300 people signed up." And I said, "Dan, none of them will come." And Dan said, "I will pick you up at 5:30. So he did. And we drove through this nightmarish night in Chicago. and had a wonderful evening discussing Heschel, me, Dan, and 6 other people who braved the cold out of the 300 who had signed up. And Dan was thrilled with the program and incredibly proud of the fact that he had run it and not canceled it. That was the lunacy of the love that Dan Cedarbaum had for Torah and for the people he cared about. If you were a recipient of Dan's love, you know exactly what I was talking about. He just had an incredible ability to care about people and to build institutions and programs that brought people, as Catherine's already said, that brought people together who you might not otherwise expect to find together in the room. In memory of Dan, I want to share just a brief piece of learning about texts that he and I spoke about both in context of classes and one-on-one. Morty, if you don't mind sharing that, that would be great. Can you do that? So I want to share with you 2 texts that are probably familiar to many people. They are 2 of the most well-known passages about the mitzvah of the halachta bidrachav, of walking in God's ways. The first one from Midrash Sifrei, in Parshat Ekev, says the following. I'll read in English just in the interest of time, although I think Dan would have protested. To walk in all God's ways. These are the ways of the Lord God, merciful and gracious. Scripture says, and it shall come to pass that whoever shall be called by the name of the Lord shall be delivered. How is it possible for a person to be called by the name of the Lord? Rather, as God is called merciful, Rachum, so should you be merciful. As the Blessed Holy One is called gracious, so should you be gracious. As God is called righteous, so should you be righteous. As God is called merciful, so should you too be merciful. And now scroll down for a minute, because I want to look at these texts together for a second. And then famously, the Talmudic passage from Masechet Sotah, Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Chanina, said, what means the text, you shall walk after the Lord your God? Is it possible for a human being to walk after the Shekhinah, the divine presence? For after all, it has been said, the Lord your God is an Eish Ochla, a devouring fire. How can you walk after a devouring fire? But the meaning is to walk after the attributes of the Blessed Holy One. As God clothes the naked, so you too clothe the naked. The Blessed Holy One visited the sick, so you too visit the sick. The Blessed Holy One comforted mourners, so you too comfort the mourners. The Blessed Holy One buried the dead, so you too bury the dead. These 2 rabbinic passages are, I think, incredibly important to read together, because read as a pair, they overcome mistakes that it is possible to make when we read only one. The first passage is about attributes. It is about mercy and compassion and graciousness in the deep sense of giving people more than they have a right to ask or deserve from you. The problem is, if you have a text that is, if you understand walking in God's ways as only about attributes, perhaps you will misunderstand and think that actual concrete actions don't matter. What matters is my internal state. Comes along the passage from the Talmud and says, let me make it clear. Compassion that is not manifest as concrete acts in the world is not compassion at all. But lest you read the passage in Sota and think that all that matters is action, the passage from the Midrash comes along and says, it is not only what we do, but who we are when we do it. It is also about the love we bring. Midat HaChesed Sheba, as another rabbinic text puts it. It is not just about showing up to the Shiva, but about who we are in showing up to the Shiva. It is not just about visiting the sick, but about being fully present with the sick. I wanted to share something about this passage from the Talmud that I can't quite remember whether Dan and I learned together, but it's the kind of thing he would have really appreciated and loved, I think. The Jewish philosopher Warren Zev Harvey makes the observation that the 4 kinds of actions that are described here, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, comforting the mourners, burying the dead. On the one hand, the reason they're presented in that order is that the verses that are brought from the Torah to prove them, as it were, are presented in the list is in the order of the verses that are cited from the Torah. But what Harvey points out on a more profound level is that you have an increasing level of irreversibility in each one of these. Just as God clothes the naked. So every individual who is in poverty can in theory be lifted out of it. We're not talking here about the social issue of poverty, but I can in theory take someone who's poor, buy them an apartment, feed them, clothe them, and give them a new life. visiting the sick, some percentage of people who are sick will get better. Some tragically, painfully, unbearably will not. Comforting the mourners, everyone who is a mourner has suffered a loss that is irreversible. But the way the loss sits with them and the way they carry the loss changes and evolves over time. And burying the dead, well, the dead have died and will not be coming back. Now, Harvey makes this list, makes this observation, but I think fails to make what I think is another step we might take, which is that perhaps the reason this is described this way is because irreversibility, in my experience, at least pastorally, is often very closely tied up with fear. That's why when kids can't really talk or understand, we find it delightful. But when the elderly can't talk or understand, we find it dreadful and so painful. And this matters because what enables us, I think, to walk in God's ways, to embody compassion, to show up for people, is our willingness to sit with our own fear and not be governed by it. Walking in God's ways depends on not being governed by our fear and being committed to being fully present with people, no matter what they're going through. This is, to use my language, not the language of the text, about compassion rather than pity. Compassion is fundamentally horizontal, whereas pity is vertical. When I pity someone, I reach down to them. When I show compassion to someone, I reach across to them. And that's the meaning, the highest meaning, I think, of walking in God's ways, is to reach across to people in a sense of shared humanity, rather than down to them from a posture of superiority. That is, Maimonides says in the guide, Tachlit ma'alat ha'adam, the highest level a person can achieve in this lifetime. I was thinking about Dan as I was preparing this, because in the book that I'm currently writing, I talk a little bit about how genuine compassion is self-effacing. You don't do a mitzvah and call a press conference. You don't constantly call attention to yourself. Dan's chesed, Dan's kindness, was totally self-effacing. Dan spent a lot of his life placing other people in front of rooms, making sure they had the audience he believed that they wanted and needed, and that they had, the belief that they had something that ought to be heard. And his kindness was incredibly understated. And there's something beautiful and righteous about that, about chesed that doesn't call attention to himself, that doesn't call attention to itself. I just want to invite us, in the same spirit as Catherine's words, to consider, in memory of Dan, doing a little extra kindness, working to become just a little bit kinder, and doing it in a way that is quiet and modest and humble, and that centers other people. That's who Dan was, and that's something we can all learn from him and treasure about his memory. Yehi zichro baruch.
Amen. This is incredibly difficult. I want to express thanks to Hadar and to the Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, and of course to Judaism Unbound and Jewish Live, and so many people that have helped make this possible. Such a difficult endeavor, especially in these days following Dan's untimely death. It's also difficult because the previous speakers, all colleagues and scholars and friends, have brought me to tears. Dan Cedarbaum was indeed one of the most loving and gentle and supportive and generous and humble teachers and friends and chavrutas I have ever known. So many of the stories that Shai just recounted, I share, but somehow, Shai, they were about a different conference in a different city, but so similar Dan was such a man of integrity and consistency that our stories almost entirely overlap. He was a true Renaissance man, a Harvard man, a man of Evanston, a man who loved Israel in all of its complexity and absurdities. He would call me on a regular basis, just like Shai described, and say, "Can I just ask you, I just need to talk to you for a second. I just have one question." And of course, those conversations were never just a minute. It was never just one question. They often turned into conversations that lasted hours. Dan had an insatiable love, not only of knowledge in general, but of love of Torah and a deep curiosity about ideas and about people and about how they intersect in the world. His love was so intense that even when some people that he respected in terms of their thought and writing, even when those people behaved in, let's say, absurd ways, or when our friends and colleagues might be arguing with each other over details that were about as, generally, they're about as small as the things that Kaplan and his colleagues argued about at the seminary and elsewhere for so many decades. Dan had this spirit about him, which really is what the Mishnah says about Aaron, that he was somebody who brought people closer to Torah. And that's what I think Dan was doing all the time, bringing people closer to Torah in its greatest sense, but also making peace between people. Peace by bringing people to panels together, by having us sit together in storms. And in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown, many of you were there. It was like that conference was never going to happen, but somehow or another, dozens and dozens of scholars made it through a snowstorm to get to that first Kaplan conference at Georgetown. And Dan was giddy. He was simply giddy with the idea of having that first Kaplan Center conference happen by bringing Kaplan students and bringing people who could talk about every aspect of Kaplan, who came from near and far from Israel and all across North America. And he just loved the absurdities of each one of us. He loved the absurdities of each one of us. Dan was, I think, in the world of ideas, whether it was in the Hadar Beit Midrash or at Hartman, also a non-rabbi, received like a rabbi and a scholar that he was engaging in Torah and eating it up, whatever the idea was, like he was a kid in a candy shop. It reminded, in reflecting on Dan and our sense of his spirit and his light and sweetness that he brought to us, whether he was visiting us in New York or Jerusalem or Cincinnati, plans to visit us, of course, in Baltimore. We met him many times in Chicago, but he was always had that spirit of joy, like he was tasting something sweet. What we read in Song of Songs, that it was like dvash v'chalav tachat leshono. Torah to him was like the sweetness of honey and milk under his tongue. And every time he tasted a new idea or learned a new word or a prayer or a new ritual in contemporary Hebrew, it was like he had tasted a new kind of honey, or I might even say tasted a new kind of scotch. Many of the conferences that we met at would end, thankfully, no matter how great or awful said panel might have been, or said meeting with another person about the Kaplan Center might have been, no matter what, they often ended by meeting in the lobby bar and drinking scotch and, what can I say, reviewing every single moment of the last panel or the last day of the conference as though he was engaging in a microscopic study of it, but not for the sake of criticism, which would be true of so many of us and so many occasions, of course. But his examination of things under a microscope was out of joy, was wanting to understand even the ridiculous aspects even better, and to laugh at them with even a deeper sense of the appreciation of humanity. I want to share, as we move toward move closer to our conclusion, I want to share two texts that when I think of Dan and his joy and his laughter, I remember him laughing about the most. The first is actually a critique of Kaplan by Rabbi Professor Eugene Borowitz of blessed memory, one of the major engagers with Kaplan from a very different theological perspective. And at that first Kaplan conference, Dan made sure that there was a panel of Reform theologians and thinkers to talk about Kaplan's impact on the Reform movement. Dan was quite sure, and ultimately I agreed with him, that it could be that Kaplan's impact on the Reform movement is even greater than his impact on his home movements as we speak in our time. So first, a critique of Kaplan that always made Dan laugh, and then some words of Kaplan himself, Dan's most favored thinker with whom he was in dialogue through the journals and through the archives all around the country and through Kaplan's friends and students every single day. It was, as we read in the Psalms, Dan was engaged with Kaplan and his interpretations of the Jewish world and of Torah the way that people are engaged. The psalmist wants to be engaged with Torah. Kol hayom hisichati, ma'ahavti, right? How much do I love your Torah? It is to me every day my significant other in conversation. So first, the piece from a Borowitz very early critique of Kaplan. Toward the end of his life, Borowitz said to me that that Kaplan was very serious. The real problem was that instead of calling his book Judaism as a Civilization, if he had just called it Judaism as a religious civilization, he might not have been so deeply critiqued. But the truly, truly hysterical thing or the thing that caused Dan to laugh so much and so often was an early statement by Borowitz when he reflected on Kaplan's theology, where he imitates what he understands Kaplan to be saying. And so it begins, although I disagree so deeply with everything that Kaplan says, my main difficulty is the way he dresses God. If I were to imitate a Kaplan blessing, it would be this. While Kaplan refers to God in the singular, the power as such, as a single entity, has no individual existence. It is a contradiction in terms for Borowitz. It is erroneous. The terms power and process, Borowitz is saying about Kaplan, are useful precisely because they are natural, that is, objective, impersonal, mechanical. But moral ends are inevitably tied up with personality, with freedom, will, and choice. And he continues the critique. How then can we understand them as making for moral ends, these ideas, and stake our whole existence on the outcome? I find I cannot pray to this God that Kaplan describes, particularly in the language of the tradition. Shall I address forces that I cannot hear? Or shall I address forces that cannot hear? Shall I speak to myself and my ideas about the universe and call this prayer? I cannot even say a simple blessing, like the one for the Hanukkah candles, when my mind, without which I cannot pray, understands the Hebrew words, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah. In Kaplan's terms, it would be saying the following: I acknowledge those processes in the universe which make for my highest fulfillment, which predominate in it, and to which our people has been devoted thereby creating activities which help the individual and group achieve self-fulfillment, one of which, ennobling activities, is to kindle these Hanukkah candles. To this, Borowitz says, I cannot say Amen. The second piece I want to share is really Kaplan at his best in a journal entry. Of course, we now have, thanks to Mel Skult, we have 3 volumes of the journal entries, and we should be sure to read carefully each one of them. And I'm quite convinced that Dan knew most of them nearly by heart. But in a relatively recent, toward the beginning of the pandemic, and thanks to Dan Liebenson and Jewish Live, Dan Cedarbaum was able to host an event which was just an examination. It was a deep dive into Kaplan's Haggadah, the Haggadah that Kaplan edited with others, but which really launched the process of American Jewish thinkers, and certainly an Orthodox institution, formalizing a process of cherem, right? You all know what that means. I don't have to explain it, do I, Shai? Give me the Hebrew word, somebody, of the English word, rather, of cherem, of really...
Excommunication.
Thank you so much. Excommunication. So, of course, Dan loved that period of Kaplan's life a great, great deal. And Dan in particular loved the ways in which his colleagues, Kaplan's colleagues at the seminary at the time, 1941, really truly began to understand the radical theology of Kaplan. And what Dan really loved about this particular session that we did about the Haggadah, Kaplan's the first edition of that Haggadah, was the ways in which Kaplan understood exactly what he was doing and exactly the kind of wrath that might befall him, but he also knew the deep corrective. Kaplan knew the deep corrective he was making for the Jewish people. And so I want to share, if I might, a piece of that as we conclude this session. Which is that the new Haggadah had just been published. Here it is. And it's April 29th, 1941. And here's what he says that people are understanding right away about Kaplan and chosenness. The elimination from the Kiddush in the Haggadah, the reference to our being a chosen people, has called down upon me the vociferous protestations of the great, Dan loved this, do-nothings, who command positions of spiritual influence in Jewish life. I anticipated the storm which has broken loose and which may develop into a hurricane. But I had to dislodge from the Jewish mentality an idea which was bound to be most obstructive in any growth, reconstruction, and progress in Jewish life. The very act of affirming with all the solemn pretense of prayer an idea which is not taken seriously and which is in fact is flouted and ridiculed is the greatest offense against elemental decency. That Jews could be so insensitive as to permit themselves such flummery would be evidence either of senility or degeneracy. I could not continue to work for the Jewish cause if it was to be inextricably tied up with such unfeeling disregard for the sanctity of prayer. Thank God, that's my favorite part. Thank God I have had the courage to go through with this excision of such a cancerous growth from the Jewish consciousness. What Dan loved about that so much was not only Kaplan's clarity, but Kaplan's sense of himself as redeeming the Jewish people on a theological level, while cracking open all of theology, all of Jewish history, all of Jewish thought, and all of Jewish prayer for the future. Dan wanted to do that too. Dan wanted to be that person who could help break open any idea or any problem or any institution. In a world of Jewish ideas, a kid in a candy shop, he was always giddy with the oldest and newest discovery, joyful, always exploring, always sure that the next great idea or conference was right around the corner. May his blessing, may his memory be for a blessing. Yehi zichro baruch.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Catherine, Shai, Joey, for your words and for your music. I think we can all see why Dan was so fond of you. And one of the great honors of this program is that we also have quite a number of members of the Cedarbaum Jacobs family joining us tonight. And I'd like to call on Jacob Cedarbaum, one of Dan's sons, to say a few words.
Thanks, Eric. I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback from my mom's computer. Can you? Okay. Just on behalf of my whole family, particularly my brother and my mom, I want to thank all of our speakers for tonight, and for everybody who participated in what I think everybody pointed out would be among the most fitting memorials for my dad. A few things, aside from maybe a good meal and a great wine, gave him as much joy as studying Jewish texts with the people that he loved. And so, you know, while we still are finding our way out of this loss, one of the bright moments has been seeing Dan's, you know, various Jewish communities come together, and just see how loved and cared about he was across all of these different communities, which we didn't know as well. We knew him as kind of, you know, as my dad, and doing dad things like taking us go-karting and playing hearts and planning vacations. And then he would go off on the weekend to any number of synagogues and disappear for a while and then come back. And I always wondered what he was up to, and now I have a little more insight into that. And so, you know, that's just been really beautiful to see through this teaching and through a number of other teachings that we've gotten to be a part of in his memory. You know, the last thing I'll say, just from my standpoint, my brother and I shared in our eulogy that one of our early childhood memories, or one of our strongest early childhood memories, was our dad forcibly waking us up on Sunday mornings to go to Hebrew school, and us pleading for, you know, another 5 to 10 minutes of sleep. And while none of us became the Jewish scholar or really even intensely spiritual Jews, I'm so happy that he did that for us, because as a result, we grew up with these beautiful Jewish communities, and have continued to maintain our Jewish identity, you know, in our own personal ways as we've grown up. And I know that, you know, I'll have this community for the rest of my life, and seeing what it meant to my dad and all of the people, you know, to whom he meant so much, is just further further evidence of how beautiful that is and how strong that Jewish bond is. So thank you again on behalf of our family. And I will throw it back to Eric or whomever is going to conclude.
Thanks, Jacob. I feel the same way in the sense that Dan would talk about you and your brother and of course Karen, but while he was alive, I didn't have the opportunity to share times with you, and our hope, and I think I'm speaking for everyone on the call, our hope is that you continue as a family to find strength in each other and comfort in your memories of him. The eulogies from Dan's funeral service are posted on the Kaplan Center website at kaplancenter.org, and I found them personally very, very moving and beautiful to hear, Jacob, what you and Sam wrote and what was read on behalf of Karen. And there's also the eulogy that Jeffrey Shine delivered on behalf of the Kaplan Center board. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. As many of you said, a lot of us met through Dad, at events that Dan created that we all joined. And I'm sure that we'll continue to meet, whether it's at the Beit Midrash of Hadar or at get-togethers of One Jewish Evanston, programs of Judaism Unbound, or yes, events at the Kaplan Center, the institution that Dan created and steered with such intelligence and menschlichkeit, as I think we've all seen so strongly in these last 30 plus days. Dan's memory will surely be a blessing and will live within us forever. Good night.